What is up, APUSH? Okay, so I got really nervous after my last screencast because it was like an hour and 11 minutes. And I was afraid that if I did my two WAP classes without saving it, that it might disappear. So, what I'm doing for this unit, guys, is I'm posting unit for part 1A lecture. And then this screencast, which will be only like 10 minutes, is going to be the rest of part one, which will have the SAQ on it, because we're almost finished with Unit 4, Part 1. And we ended last class with, or I should say, ending the last screencast with the Monroe Doctrine and talking about expansion. And then we get to another key election. So, two of our really most important elections in American history actually come in early in the 19th century. The first one's 1800 with Thomas Jefferson. The second one is this election of 1824. And it's because of how it's resolved. Now, this one is weird because we have four presidential candidates. And John Quincy Adams, the son of our second president, John Adams, Henry Clay from Kentucky from the West, another candidate from the West, Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson is a very complicated individual. He's actually originally from the Carolinas. He's an orphan, but he made his political career out West, especially in Tennessee. Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson don't like each other because both of them are competing for votes out in the West. Now, there's also another candidate, a fourth candidate, William Crawford, who has a stroke. He's from the South. But all four of these candidates are claiming to be Republicans. And that kind of shows where we're transitioning in American politics, because they're claiming to be Republicans because they're claiming to be non federalists. Now, Republicans, it's not really a Republican Party yet. It is not the Republican Party. The Republican Party is not going to come for another 30 years. But they're essentially saying that they are Democratic Republicans and that they're not Federalists. And the reason why they're claiming to not be Federalists is because federalism, the Federalists became associated with aristocracy. It became associated with New England, and all of these people are claiming to be representatives of the common man. This election of 1824 is very much about the expansion of suffrage. As more and more people, especially out West, have the right to vote, they've lowered the property requirements. More and more people are voting, and so politicians are having to pretend, if no other way, to identify with these very poor people. And because of this, that's exactly what we see. Henry Clay is doing that. Andrew Jackson is doing that. And we have a very complicated election because you need to have, and as you still do, you need to have a majority of electoral college votes to become president. You only need 51%, but you need to have a majority of the electoral college vote. And because we have so many candidates and because these votes are spread out, what we see in this election of 1824 is no one gets a majority. No, Andrew Jackson, depicted in green down here, got 43% of the vote. The next closest was John Quincy Adams with only 31% of the vote. The popular vote certainly was in the hands of Jackson. However, he cannot become president because he didn't get a majority. And so therefore, pursuant to the 12th Amendment, it comes down to the House of Representatives to pick the next president out of the top three vote getters. It just so happens that Henry Clay is, in fact, our Speaker of the House. He gets to kind of push the House any way that he wants, but because he wasn't in the top three, he now has to decide between the top three. Now, Crawford has a stroke, so really it comes down to Jackson or John Quincy Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams and Clay kind of see eye to eye in a couple of things. John Quincy Adams actually is a favoring nationalism. He's favoring internal improvements connecting the West to the East. And because of this, he kind of sees Adams as the lesser of two evils. He's competing for votes out in the West with Andrew Jackson. He also looks at Andrew Jackson as a little bit of a brute and a thug. He denounces him for marching into Florida. And so Clay meets in secret with John Quincy Adams And it just so happens that Adams becomes our next president, and that the next day, Henry Clay is announced as Secretary of State. Now, this was common practice. It was common practice to promise somebody a position in the department without actually becoming the president yet. That is very common practice. Did John Quincy Adams actually do something corrupt? Probably not. But it doesn't matter about what actually happened or not. It matters about the perception. And for the entirety of John Quincy Adams' presidency, we see a looming mob of Jacksonians, of Jacksonites, that are becoming more and more politically powerful, calling this the corrupt bargain. And this is where more and more states are going to start to denounce aristocracy and promote being the common man and say Jackson is the common man. And this is where Jackson really gets his popularity, and it dooms John Quincy Adams' presidency. John Quincy Adams is a president for 4 years, but right from the get-go, he is a very unpopular president. He's plagued from the start by those rumors of the corrupt bargain, rightfully so. He also, less than a third of the country voted for him. He's the first minority president in the sense that only 31% of the country voted for him. And ever since 1820, where we had our Missouri Compromise, 1820 is the mark. It's the end of our era of good feelings. The era of good feelings is defined by all sections of the country wanting to work together to promote an economy in which everybody works side by side, hand by hand, in which we're trading throughout the country. And yet, now here we are in 1825, 5 years after the Missouri Compromise, and now it's back to sectionalism. It's back to distrust between the North and the South about especially slavery, of course. And John Quincy Adams is a little bit out of date. He's out of touch. He's a nationalist. He's promoting nationalism in a time of sectionalism. He even is so out of touch to promote funding a federal national observatory to look at the stars to the farmers out west. This looks like a blasphemous waste of money. And he is going to promote to Congress to pay for roads, canals, and a national university, which Congress is going to meet with deaf ears because we're once again in a time of sectionalism. And so, John Quincy Adams, he really doesn't get a lot done in his presidency. And he just seems to be kind of the stopgap for the ever growing mob of supporters for Andrew Jackson. And then in the following election of 1828, Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson is elected president. He's known primarily as being a war hero, an Indian fighter, and of course for his famous battle at New Orleans against the British in the War of 1812. Of course, he's not that, right? Andrew Jackson he has a plantation, Hermitage. It's a large cotton plantation. He employs, by the time he dies, over 140 slaves. I mean, this guy was a rich man, and the reason, however, he was called a common man is because he came from very humble beginnings. He was an orphan. He did not receive much formal education at all. In fact, he may have only received a couple of years of primary school education, but he certainly was not a common man at this stage of his career. But what becomes important is portraying yourself as the common man to appeal to all of the poor people that are now able to vote. And so when you look at who voted, you can see that this was Jackson really commanded everything but New England. I mean, when you look at where he's getting votes, obviously Florida, they're a territory yet. They don't have electoral college vote, the same as Arkansas, but a solid West and Southern coalition that is going to win Andrew Jackson the presidency. The only people voting for John Quincy Adams, obviously up here in New England. What are the requirements? Universal male suffrage of whites. That is why Andrew Jackson is seen as this common man. And you can see it in a number of ways. He opens up the White House for the mob to come in and celebrate with him on his first day as president. In fact, he actually has to spend his first night in the White House at a hotel down the street because of the huge party and ruckus that went on with with the mob. Okay, so what are some of the things that Jackson's going to do? Right away, he's going to start rewarding people that got him the office. He is going to introduce the spoil system in a major way to the federal government. And this obviously is a negative thing because now we have taken away the obligation of civic employees to come in and to do what is best for the country. That's what republicanism is. It is to put aside your own selfish desires to do what's best for the country. Jackson now is saying you need to do what's best for the party. You need to come in and to reward your party members for getting you to this point. And this is going to start some bitter partisan rivalries in which each new president is going to come in and try to remove what the previous administration had done. And again, patronage becomes a mainstay in American politics. So that's one of the first negative things that Andrew Jackson does. And also in doing this, he's going to appoint some absolute crooks to be in his administration. For instance, a customs official in New York who was appointed because of his loyalty to Jackson is going to collect taxes in New York, then steal $1 million and sail for England. So these are the kind of people that Jackson has appointed into the government. And right away, Jackson's going to have to deal with what becomes the nullification crisis. Kind of a tricky situation that the Jacksonites find themselves in. First of all, the Industrial Revolution has made its way to the United States at this stage. Again, manufacturing increased during the War of 1812, and now at this point, 13 years later, at the end of the war, manufacturing is flourishing in New England, and many of these northern states are calling for higher tariffs. They want protection for their manufactured goods so that they don't have to compete with all of the manufactured goods from Europe, especially England. So the Jacksonites are going to play a very political game. In the last year of John Quincy Adams' presidency, they're going to propose a very high tariff. And what they're intending to do is to have John Quincy Adams veto it, and then he's going to lose popularity in New England. They think John Quincy Adams is going to veto this high tariff because he knows it's political suicide if he allows it to pass. And by vetoing it, he's going to lose popularity in New England. That was the thought process with Jacksonites in Congress. It fails. The tariff actually passes. He doesn't veto it. And what happens is now Jackson inherits this hugely high tariff, what the South calls the tariff of abominations. And this introduces a majorly important concept, guys, in the antebellum era, and really just in general in American history, hostility towards tariffs. Who is going to like tariffs? Who's going to be hostile to tariffs? If you are manufacturing goods, okay, especially early on in the first industrial revolution where we don't have these major factory systems mass producing all of these goods. In fact, you were producing things much slower. And when you're producing things, you were selling them largely domestically. You were selling them to people within the country. But when you are a farmer and you're producing massive crops of wheat or corn or cotton, those massive crops can't be consumed by just our country. They have to be consumed by multiple countries. And in fact, when you look at the South, here we are in 1828, the cotton gin was invented in 1793. So the South now is heavily devoted to cotton. Who is going to be buying most Southern cotton? That's going to be going to Great Britain because of the textile industries. So the tariff, unfortunately for the South, is a doubly bad situation. Why? Because England is producing all these manufactured goods. England's goods are going to be taxed because they're coming over to the United States. That means that our domestic industries are protected. That means if you're in New England, you can raise your prices a little bit because the goods from England have such a high tax on them that you're not going to buy from England. And so the South, since they're not producing their own manufactured goods, have to buy American, and they have to buy these inflated prices from Northern producers. The other problem with the tariff is that because the United States has put up this high tariff, now England's putting up a high tariff, now France is putting up a high tariff, all these other countries are putting up tariffs, and now Southern planters have to lower the prices of their own cotton so that they can compete with domestic producers in England, in France, etc. And so what happens is the South now is buying expensive northern goods from their own country and then having to lower their own prices to trade with places like England and France, especially England. And so this really upsets the South. And it especially, the icing on top of the cake is the fact that once again, this is the federal government enacting a tariff, a tax that is affecting all of the states. Once again, the South is going to have a resentment to the federal government, and they are going to say state rights, state rights, state rights. And who, of course, is our state that is always upset by the federal government? That's South Carolina. South Carolina is now being the most outspoken South Carolinian is the current vice president, John C. Calhoun. He's Yale educated. He's very intelligent. And he is going to build upon the Madison and Jefferson, Kentucky and Virginia resolutions back from 1798 and the process, or the at least theory, of nullification. And he says that the state should nullify the tariff. He promotes nullification, and yet nothing happens. The states are interested in it, but yet nothing yet is going to take action until Congress passes a lesser tariff in 1832. Now, the lesser tariff in 1832, it is in fact a lesser tax on imported goods, but it has this air that it's going to be around, that they have appeased the southern states by lowering the tariff, but this tariff is going to be there for good. And this is going to scare South Carolina. And South Carolina is going to meet, their state legislature is going to meet, and many nullies are going to declare the tariff null and void in South Carolina. We're not going to pay this tariff. It does not affect us. And in fact, Andrew Jackson is going to say, all right, well then, if you are going to try to do this, if you're going to try to declare our tariff null, then we're going to come in and collect it by force. And South Carolina says, if you do that, then we're going to secede. And so here we are in 1832, and South Carolina is already talking about secession, but they believe in this moment that if they secede, that other states will follow them. And yet, none of the other southern states are as radical as South Carolina is yet. We're only in 1832, and so South Carolina is really by themselves, and Andrew Jackson is not going to allow this. And so he says that you are going to either pay the tariff, or I am going to raise an army, invade you, and hang all of the nullifiers. And he starts preparing an army to do this. And finally, it looks as like we may have a war between the United States and South Carolina before once again your boy Henry Clay comes in and bargains a compromise tariff of 1833, which is going to lower the tariff over 10 years until by the time we get to that end of the 10-year period, it's down to the very marginal rates of the tariff of 1816. But Congress also, as part of this compromise, passes the force bill that says the president can use the Army or the Navy to collect tariff duties. South Carolina forced to back down. They meet in their state legislature again. They repeal the nullification. They repeal their law of nullification and the nullification of the tariff laws. But before they do that, they do this little kind of bitter sour grapes move. They actually nullify the force bill before they repeal nullification. Kind of a sign for things to come with the dissentment of South Carolina. Henry Clay, once again the hero. He's already bargained his way out of two potential serious threats to the country. And now we talk about the treatment of Native Americans under Andrew Jackson, which of course is one of his biggest lasting legacies. We have 5 civilized tribes. Right now, the United States has been practicing the policy of assimilation. You need to assimilate into American society. And this is obviously a very difficult task for most Native American groups who are often living in semi-nomadic lifestyles. They don't believe in the private ownership of land. And now, because the U.S. government is forcing assimilation, many Native American tribes just simply moved out of the United States. They moved to the west of the Mississippi. But there are 5 tribes that attempted very seriously to assimilate into the South. A great example is the Cherokee. The Cherokee are going to do everything that Americans ask them to do. They are going to abandon their semi-nomadic way of life. They are going to have private property, own private property, and they're going to draw up a constitution with 3 branches of government. I mean, they are completely assimilated into American life, and yet they're living in several states, but predominantly in Georgia. Now, Georgia is going to say this isn't good enough. And the state of Georgia, the state legislature is going to say we have jurisdiction over anyone in our state, including Native Americans and their land. And the Cherokee is going to appeal to the Supreme Court and say, Georgia shouldn't be able to do this. This is our land. We've assimilated. And the Supreme Court says, you're right, Cherokee. You're absolutely right. You have entitled to your land. Georgia can't tell you what to do. You are allowed and entitled to your land. President Jackson, the racist Indian hater that he is going to defy the federal government, his own Supreme Court, and say, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And what he means is, okay, so what? You've made a decision that the Cherokee are entitled to their land. What are you going to do about it if I come in and push them out of their land? And that's exactly what he does. He is going to persuade Congress to pass the monumental Indian Removal Act of 1830, which is going to, and yes, this is contradictory, this is not a typo, require the voluntary immigration from all land east of the Mississippi to Indian Territory. And of course, it is not voluntary if it's required. And this is exactly what happens. And we see these 5 civilized tribes, the Seminole, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw, are being forced to move to modern-day Oklahoma, which at the time was called Indian Territory. And this was supposed to be a permanent frontier line that would not ever be passed. Of course, this is only going to last 15 years as Americans continue to move into Native American territory. Today, we have 50 Indian reservations in the United States, all of which are to the west of the Mississippi. This Indian Removal Act did what it was intended to do by Congress in 1830, and it forced the movement. It says here 100,000 Native Americans. When it's all said and done, it's going to be 125,000 Americans, because many Native Americans, especially the Cherokee, remained to the east of the Mississippi until finally the U.S. government forced them, the forced relocation. That was where we see that trail of tears. That was in the winter of 1838 to 1839. And that was where this 116-day march where 4,000 Cherokee perished as they were forced to march to the west of the Mississippi. So really nasty, contradictory treatment of Native Americans by the U.S. government. And then the other major thing that Andrew Jackson does is kill the bank and set up a really awful situation with the economy. And really ironically hurts the West in a really drastic way with the panic that ensues. But his thought process is that the national bank is corrupt. And he has reason to believe that the national bank is corrupt because it's privately owned by very many rich Americans, and it controls all of the nation's gold and silver. What it does is it loans out this gold and silver to other banks, and then those banks are going to produce their own paper currency and give that to people. And then, of course, they need to have the gold and the silver in their bank's vaults to be able to back up that paper currency. But depending on how much gold and silver each bank in the country has is how much money they can give out or how much their paper currency is worth. And how much gold and silver is loaned out to the different banks of the country depends completely on the private investors of the national bank. The national bank also has a president appointed by James Monroe himself, and that was Nicholas Biddle, and he can decide when to raise interest rates, when to lower interest rates. So really, all of the banks in the United States are being controlled by these private investors and by this bank president, Nicholas Biddle. That's a tremendous amount of power and wealth that these private investors have. And sometimes they're operating not in the best interest of the country, but the best interest of themselves to make money on the interest that is being made through the bank. Now that's our situation. Now Jackson distrusts the way that these banks are set up, and he also distrusts the fact that when the bank cut off loans to the Western banks, the wildcat banks, back in the 1817, 1818, which led to the Panic of 1819. And so this is going to cause Jackson to try and kill the bank and successfully kill the bank. The National Bank is due to expire after its 20-year rechartering after the War of 1812. It's due to expire in 1836. So Jackson isn't even going to let it expire. He's going to kill it before it expires, because when he collects tax money from the people, he stops depositing it into the bank, and instead he's going to use that money, the tax money, for everyday government expenditures. So that national bank is going to start going bankrupt, and eventually does go bankrupt. And where is he going to put the excess money that Jackson gets from the people? He's going to start putting them into his favorite banks in the country, these wildcat banks, which he calls his pet banks, because they're his favorite banks. But because there is no central regulating bank that is telling these banks how much money they can afford to loan and how much actual metal money that the country has, these banks start running however they want. They start running uncontrollably. And what starts to happen is that these banks, we have all these different wildcat currencies throughout the country. Some of them are worth a lot, some of them are worth nothing. Nobody knows how much money each bank has. And so the result is our banking system becomes incredibly disorganized and really no way to regulate it. When this hard money of these banks start to make their way too much out into the public, Jackson starts to try to stop this by passing a law with Congress called Specie Circular, which says that all public lands need to be purchased with hard or metallic money. This is going to put a huge stop to the real estate industry, because the hard money is really prevalent in some areas. It's very hard to find in others. This is going to kill the land speculation boom and lead to the Panic of 1837, who unfortunately this is going to break out in the first year of poor Martin Van Buren's presidency. He had no part of this, and yet as banks collapse around the country, Martin Van Buren is blamed for the Panic of 1837. Jackson is going to, over his 8-year presidency, acquire lots of enemies, lots of haters. And that is going to give birth to the Whigs. The Whig Party, and at this stage, the Democratic Party, are both not sectionalist parties. And that's a very important concept that we need to understand. The Whigs are a perfect example of this. They are people from all over the country that are united in a political party for one reason: they don't like Jackson. For instance, Jackson did not promote the American system, the internal improvements paid for the federal government. And so people that support the American system, that resent Jackson, are going to join the Whigs. Our Nullies from the South, they absolutely resist Jackson in threatening to invade South Carolina and his deal with the tariff of 1828 and then 1832. So they're going to join the Whig Party. But then our northern industrialists and merchants join the Whig Party. They need a party. They need to have political power. They've lost the Federalist Party, so they join the Whigs. I mean, think about those Nullies and those northern industrialists and merchants. They would never be in the same political party. They're only united for their hate of Andrew Jackson. And then this anti-Masonic party, and this was a small third party, but it's a party that runs against privilege. It runs against Masons, which were a secret society, and Andrew Jackson was a Mason. And so this anti-Masonic party that's coming in and joining the Whigs, this is a very important element of the Whigs, because the Whigs are able to absorb this anti-Masonic party and promising to speak out against Masons, because the Whigs now get to say, we are the party that is the common man. We are the party that is fighting out against aristocracy, against privilege, and they are going to declare that the Democrats now are the party of corruption. Both parties are trying to identify with the common man, and that is kind of the nature of politics in the antebellum era. Some memes for you. Okay, so we're almost done. We talk a couple of slides of Van Buren, and then we get to our SAQ. So Van Buren is going to inherit that financial panic that ensues after Jackson. The Western land speculation has stopped because of the Specie Circular law. the national bank is killed. The banks are running uncontrolled. We also have wheat crops that are failing. Banks are crashing in Britain. That's going to cause banks that have investments in Britain to call in their loans. That's going to cause more bank failures. What a disaster. And so unemployment is going to skyrocket, and poor Martin Van Buren is blamed for this. He's only going to be elected once. He's not going to be able to become our next president, which gives the Whigs the opportunity that they need to get into the White House. Van Buren's one law that we have to remember with him is the divorce bill, and it only really lasts for 1 year. But still, if you wanted to give some information on Van Buren, this is what you remember by him. Van Buren is Jackson's hand-picked successor. He is going to promote Van Buren as someone that will follow in his footsteps. And so Van Buren is kind of shackled to the beliefs of Jackson, to the beliefs of no central regulating bank. But during his presidency, what he realizes is that the bank did a lot of good, that it regulated the economy, and that without the bank, that we see too much money in circulation causing rampant inflation. And so Van Buren, he really probably wants to create a national bank, but can't do it because of his ties to Jackson. And so he settles for kind of this interesting compromise that divorces the bank from the state. And this is kind of an interesting way of putting it. But what this means is he's going to create an independent treasury. It is supposed to be independent of the government. This is a place where the government can put their excess money, their surplus money, but it's going to be out of circulation and it's not going to be touched by the public. That means that we're going to have less inflation in the public. It's an interesting concept. It's passed by Congress as soon as the Whigs get in power. With William Henry Harrison and a Whig Congress, they are going to get rid of it. They're going to veto it. But it lasts for the final year of Van Buren's presidency. Okay, guys, our short answer questions. Thomas Jefferson, peaceful coercion. Give an example of how the Jefferson administration demonstrated this. One way the federal government grew in power in relation to the states in the time period. And then one reason that Jackson's presidency is often called beginning, not the begging, the beginning of the age of the common man. All right, guys. Hope you guys thought that was largely review and that you remembered this kind of stuff. I'm sure this stuff will be important on our AP test. I think this is an area that could be touched upon, so let's study it hard. All right, guys, talk to you soon.